The tools that take center stage in InDesign tend to be based around type. And that's because InDesign is primarily about type layout. This is a program that's used for collation. You write, you can create imagery, you can have all these other components from other applications and other processes, and InDesign is the place where we bring it together. This is a program for dealing with multiple pages, for book layouts, for magazine layouts, for presentations to an extent. There's a lot of things like that we can do with InDesign, and a large amount of it is based around the idea of type. So that's going to be the tool we start with. So in our toolbar, we can find our type tool. Now the tool that we're on by default is our selection tool. Selection tool, the name should imply. This is what we're going to use to select things, to move things around, etc. The type tool is going to be how we start creating. Now, unlike some programs, you can't just click and type. It's not like Microsoft. You're not automatically in a cursor. What we're going to do is we're going to click and drag out a box. And this is going to create a text box. And you'll see once you have that, we can start to type letters, and that appears in this box. Now, while in here, it behaves like most text boxes, most text tools, or other programs. All right, I can click into an area, I can highlight things, I can hit delete, etc. Now, if I want to move that, I go to my selection tool. And you can see this is a little different. Now I have these control points that have popped up, these nodes. I can move my box around. I can also grab the edges, and I can resize it and reshape it. Okay. Now, I don't want to have to type a ton of text to get something to work with in here. So I'm going to, with my arrow tool selected, I can double click into here. That automatically switches me to my text tool. So that saves a little bit of time. I'm going to double click on this body of text. That actually highlights it and delete it. And now what I'm going to do is go to type, scroll all the way down to the bottom, second to last option, fill with placeholder text. And what that does is that creates a body of what we call lorem ipsum, which is this placeholder text that's supposed to give us the feel of what it would be like to have this as a full text box, right? So we don't have to worry about what it says. And this is pretty common in design to use something like this to create layouts before you have the finished text. So I can drag this in, I can drag this out, and you see the text rewrap and kind of reflow based on how much space it has. So if this is supposed to be a column, well, there's my one column text box right there, right? If this is supposed to be the whole page, I can go from one margin to the next. And I usually try to pay attention to these margins. You most likely by default have snap twos on, which we'll talk about down the road. But making something, at least on the sides that it kind of is lined up with, like right on these lines, not close to the line, try to avoid doing things like this. This is how you get really sloppy layouts. Oh, it's near the line. Don't do that. Put it right on the line. If it's going to be near it, have it on it. All right. So if I wanted a little bit more text, say, oh, I thought that's what I needed. Now my text box is this big. Again, go to type, placeholder text again. It'll fill up the rest of the space. Okay. So once I have this, we're going to talk about some of the differences I can see and control in my text box. First thing, I want to be able to use that. I can go to my properties palette, and that's going to give me a good amount of my options. It's not going to give me everything, so I'm going to change this up a little bit. I'm not going to use my properties palette, and you're welcome to once you kind of learn everything. It's a nice quick reference. What I'm going to do instead is go to Window, Type and Tables, and then scroll over to Character. This is going to give me my character palette, and this is everything about individual pieces of text. All right. I'm also going to open up a second one. So again, Window. All my palettes are under Window. Scroll down, Type and Tables, Paragraph. That's the second one I want. I'm going to put these together because I don't want them hanging out separately. So I'm going to grab the word paragraph, and just by the text, by the word, I'm going to grab it, and I'm going to move it till it turns blue, let go of it, and now these two are docked together, and I can toggle back and forth, and they take up a little less room. And if I don't need it, I can double click on one of the words, and it makes it a little smaller, a little more open. And sometimes you'll see there's hide options and show options in this little, what we call a hamburger menu, this stack of lines, right? So there's some changes you can make in there. Right, I'm going to start with character. One nice thing, if you want to select something, this is something that I've been hoping for a long time will some mobile applications will pick up on. I would love to have this on my phone or something like that, for example. If I click with my arrow tool once, it selects my text box, and I'll zoom out a little so you can see this a bit better. If I click twice, okay, so it gave me my type tool, and it brought me into that. Now, if I click once, it puts my cursor somewhere. If I click twice, it highlights that word. If I click 3 times, I highlight that line. 4 times, I get that paragraph. 5 times, I get the entire body of text, right? That's something that a lot of programs don't do that, again, I've been using InDesign enough that I use it so much in here. I would love to see that happen somewhere else. Again, on my phone, it would be great if I could tap a body of text, 3 times to get the paragraph or the line even. It's something I've just, it's on my wish list. It's a useful tool. All right. Just going to grab the first paragraph. 4 clicks. First paragraph. And here we have our typeface choices. So if I click on here, I can scroll through, and Adobe has what we call Adobe Type. And I have this nice long list of typefaces that are available. And these are not only, I can search the ones that are on my computer, but I can also search the Adobe typefaces themselves. They have an entire kind of repository that I can search, and we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. These are the most common ones or most recent ones I've used, right? No, I haven't been using emojis a lot, but that's a suggestion here. So say I wanted to, for example, go to a very common one, and I'm going to scroll down to the letter H and do Helvetica. So once I have Helvetica, it changes it to this typeface, all right? And now I can click here, and I can choose the style of that type. Is it Helvetica Light, which is thin, right? Light Oblique, which has an italicized look to it. Regular, Oblique, Bold, or Bold Oblique. Now these styles are based on what's available in that font face. This is choosing the actual font in the typeface or that entire family of type. Now, for example, if I wanted to do, and I'm going to just type a letter into shortcut. If I type the letter I, it's going to drop me down to I. I'm going to use Impact. Not a great font for most things, but just to give you some idea. Now, say I really wanted to Impact Italic. I click here. It doesn't exist. The reason that doesn't exist is the font designer never designed an italic version of that. This is not like Microsoft Word. There is no just quick button where we hit the letter I or we hit the letter B for bold. Those are typically called faux italics and faux bolds when you hit those buttons. We don't have that in InDesign, right? If the font designer did not create, if there is no Impact Italic, you don't have the option to use Impact Italic. You have to choose a different font or choose, just deal with the styles you have. So a lot of times when you're scrolling through, you'll see these numbers, right? Lexia, and then it says 14. If I click on it, there's 14 styles available for this font, right? So there's regular, there's thin. So these are different weights. We have advertising italic, which is nice and thick and bold. We have extra bold italic, right? So these are the different styles that this particular font is available in. So a lot of people a lot of designers will choose fonts that they're comfortable with and that they really like based on some of the variations available. Again, this is a typeface that I do like quite a bit called Big John, and it doesn't have anything else used with it. Now, the designer who did this font created a companion to it, which is called Slim Joe, which is the alternative to Big John. So there's a very thin and a very thick. So that's why I kind of try to get away with using that one a little bit for that reason. All right, so let's go back to Helvetica. I'll choose once again. All right. So if we look closely, we can see the difference was where here we had Minion was the default font, and Minion has these little kind of angles on it, right? If you look at Helvetica above it, it's these straight lines. Everything's one thickness. So let me just zoom in a little. that again, on Minion, we've got these little tabs, these little pieces that stick off, and there's also some variation in the weight, right? If you look at the O, the sides of the O are thicker than the top and the bottom of the O. This is what's called a serif face, or a serif typeface. And the reason is these little areas here, these are called serifs. Now this, Helvetica, does not have those. Everything seems to be a pretty constant weight, and also there's no little tails, no serifs on these letters. This is called sans serif. Sans being Latin for without or no. So we have serif with serifs and sans serif without serifs. Okay? So those are the two main categories we're going to talk about in terms of font selection or type selection. Now, once again, I'm going to just center this for you so you can see. All right. Now, we talked about typeface, style. Next up is font size. So you can arrow up to choose your font size, arrow down to change it. You can click this drop down and choose from here, but this is not your only limitation. You can just type in what you want. And a lot of students and beginner designers think, oh, 72, that's the highest number. That's a really big piece of font. In fact, I often ask my students, how big do they think 72 points is if I print it out? And I get answers like, oh, it's the whole page. Oh, it's half a page. It's really, really tall. It's not. 72 points is 1 inch. If we go back to the math we said before, 12 points in a pica, 6 picas in an inch, 12 times 6, 72. That is 1 inch high. It's actually not that large. If I zoom to 100%, it's not that big. When I say large type in my classes, I'm usually talking about something in the hundreds. So we want to do something big, and it ends up being, 400 point. You just type that in. And now, if you notice, it all disappeared. And I have this little, it's kind of hard to see, but this little red plus sign down here. What that means is the type that you have doesn't fit in this area anymore. And that might happen in a few situations. I'm just going to zoom or undo real quick. So I'm going to Command Z, which is undo on a PC, Control Z, right? And I undid that. If I go to grab a new piece of type, for example, and I set this to 100, and I draw out my text box, and I start to type, actually that did show up. We draw a slightly smaller text box. There's times that I'll do this, and I'll type, and nothing will happen, and students get very confused. I'm typing, I don't see any letters, but they have this box here. It means that the box is too small to see what you typed. If I grab this box with my selection tool and drag it out, eventually I'll start to see, oh, there it is, right? I want to delete that whole box. I'm just going to grab it, hit delete. All right, 2, 3, 4. All right, so now I can change my font size. Next option over, I see the parentheses. That means that this is automatically determined right now. This is called my leading. Leading is the space in between two lines, what people typically think of as single space, double space, etc. That's not called single space and double space in reality. It's called leading. Right now, auto is set, by my default, auto is set to 120%, meaning that if this type size is 10, 120% of 10 is 12 for my leading, and that's the space in between. That's kind of what you would usually call single space. If I start to arrow up, I can get a little bit more breathing room. I can get a little bit less breathing room. So I can make something a little bit tighter. And the typical we see is, again, about 120%. If you're dealing with a number under 100, what most people tend to do as their default is they set this number too higher than the font number, right? So they'll say, oh, 12-point leading, 10-point font. Or if I'm using 14-point font, they'll go with 16-point leading. This is a good starting spot. I wouldn't necessarily use this as a general rule. And the way we would say this, if somebody asked you what size this is, we would call this 14 over 16. We would say it as like a fraction. So this is 14 over 16, 14 size point, 16-point leading, right? So 16 points between the lines, between the base lines, 14 points of the actual character. If you want to do something that looks a little bit cleaner, a little bit more high-end, you can go with something that's close to, say, double space. Depends on what look you're going for and what type of spacing, what type of look you want, how easy of a read you want. Okay? So there's 20-point leading. Next option, I'm going to go straight down. All right, this is called tracking. Tracking is measured in what we call ems, which is literally the width of the letter M of that font. So that's why it's called an M. And if I up the tracking, that's the space between the letters overall. Now we can use this for a couple purposes. We can use this for style, right? So something like that where it gives it a much different look. Or we could use this for just little cleanups. Now, when I had this at 0, I had this down here, this word by itself. Typically, that's something in design we want to avoid, right? This is what we call a widow, and it's a word all by itself on its own line. Now, if I grab 2, 3, 4, this whole thing, I could pull this in by just saying -10. It's probably not going to be perceptible to most people. They're not going to realize it got any tighter, but now everything fits. So that's a big reason we use tracking, is to adjust those little things like that and clean up our document. Now, the next one to the left is called kerning. This is similar, but deals with individual letters. So if you notice, if I have everything grabbed, 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't have an option. I can't really change any numbers in here, right? It's all grayed out. I'm going to use 2 letters as an example. I'm going to type the letters A and V here, and I'm going to type the letters I and I there. Now, a lot of times I'll ask students, which one are these evenly spaced out? They say, yeah, they're about evenly spaced out. This one might be a little bit wider, right? So if I put my cursor right between those 2 letters, I can see the number of this kerning, and it's set to -74. I set my numbers here, and it's set to 0, meaning that there's actually a lot more space between these 2 letter I's than there are this A and the V. And the reason for that is, technically, if you look at where the edge of the V is and the edge of the A is, these overlap. If I set this to 0, that's even spacing between the A and the V and the 2 I's, which is a really, really big gap, right? Not ideal. So we have kerning as a way of cleaning up these little precise changes, something that might look weird. So even this right here, if I were using a big title or a big headline, I feel like that E and the C are a little bit more spaced out than the other letters in this word. So I might come in here and just arrow down a little bit. And it's also hard when you have a letter with a gap and a letter that's rounded, some things like that. Letters like an A and a V, you might want a really tight title. You might want something that, you know, is really close, something like that. Right? So it's all about style and look, but sometimes you'll just get ones that look a little odd when they're typeset. The gaps look a little unusual, and I'm going to provide you guys probably with some examples of that as we go, so you can start to see what kerning really does. There's a great game online, if you Google the kerning game, that somebody made to kind of see how good your eye is at figuring out those distances. All right? Okay. Now, the next couple options on here, I'm going to try to get you to shy away from. This is vertical and horizontal distortion. Especially in the beginning, don't use these, okay? This is type skew where it rotates it. Again, I wouldn't use that. The only one that you may want to use is this right here, is a baseline shift. Baseline shift refers to if you were doing something that says, say, has exponents or something like that. You know, the example being, whoops, didn't mean that Z in there. H2O, and I wanted this to be a subscript. Instead of just hitting a subscript button or using a subscript font, I could shift where this baseline is. A lot of students use this for one thing, forget that they used it, and then all of their text is wacky and out of alignment, and they can't figure out why. Until you're really comfortable with this program, I would avoid these 4 boxes so you don't get yourself into a situation that gets a little tricky to deal with. All right? The next thing I want to deal with is our paragraph palette. So if I go to paragraph, and I'm going to grab everything for this, Command A is a shortcut to select all. So I have left alignment, which is also called ragged right, because the right side is all jagged, right? So everything's aligned left. Center alignment, everything's centered. Right alignment. Then we have left justified. Both sides are aligned, but if there's a last line, it favors the left-hand side, not the right. center justified. So you see that last line of each paragraph centered. Right justified. So again, here, those are all right aligned. Or full justified. I never really use this one because you wind up with things like this, which look really awkward. Don't use this. Then we have inside and outside. So what those do is those are based on the, or I'm sorry, not inside and outside, but away and towards. And these are based on what page you're on. So if I do away or towards, so first we have towards spine. Anytime that's on the left-hand side, it'll be right aligned. But if I move this over, it automatically corrects its alignment to being left aligned now. Or the inverse, away from spine, it's always going to be aligned away from that edge. All right. Now with this whole document selected, or this whole text box selected, I can also add some other changes. I'm just going to go back to left justified. I could do space before, and that'll put a little bit of a space before each paragraph starts. Or I could do space after, and you'll see that sometimes that ends up compounding, right? So you have a little bit of space before and a little bit of space after. So if I have one pica before, one pica after, now I have two picas. If I click ignore, I can actually stop it from, I can change how much this adds up. So if I set it to a 1 pica limit, 1 pica before and 1 pica after, at least that'll kind of cap out, so it won't let me continuously compound that. All right, the next option I want to discuss is what we call drop caps. Drop caps, you choose how many lines you would like, this amount of letters. So for example, right now, one letter is going to be 3 lines high. So you can see my first letter, H, is 3 lines high. I could also make that my first, say, 2 letters or 3 letters. And in this particular case, it gets a little messy. You might only do this for the first paragraph of a chapter or something like that. But it's a nice way to stylize something and draw attention to it, right? We have paragraph shading, puts a color behind your paragraph. If paragraph border, puts a border around your text boxes, okay? And if you want to control this, you have a color option here, which we'll get to in a later video, or you can hold down Option and click on this little palette, and you can get your options for your border and your shading. So my shading, I can control the corner radius, the offset, which is how much kind of indentation it gets. And if I click on preview, we can see it change in real time. All right. Not something we're going to use a ton in the beginning, just something I want you to know is there. So again, by holding Option and going into either of these two boxes, you can pull up those options. All right. And then lastly, we have hyphenate. You can turn off hyphenations. If you're doing a headline, doing a big title, you're doing something that you don't like the way the hyphenations look. I get very annoyed when there's a ton of hyphens and stuff. So a lot of times in titles and things like that, I turn off hyphenations, and you can see that the hyphens either appear or disappear. So if you can't fit a word, it won't break it up. All right. And that is a quick overview of the type tools, the character palette, and the paragraph palette. So hopefully you guys have a little bit of an understanding. You can see a lot of those things are repeated in here, and this is one of those that you just need to play around with and kind of get used to over time. All right. Hopefully that made sense.